And as you will see, going off of our conversation about stereotypes and those kinds of things, these cognitive biases can lead to judgment errors that we'll see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay. So when we talk about, again, we'll just go into what is a cognitive bias, okay? A cognitive bias is a subconscious mental shortcuts that help simplify complex information but can lead to errors. Okay, and the important parts of this conversation is what is meant by subconscious. Okay, we we can have an overt conscious bias, right? We could think of negatively of some group because of our limited interactions with them, and come up with very overt conscious biases. We also talked about implicit stereotypes and implicit; those are things that unconsciously we bring to light, that come out in our behaviors and our attitudes. Okay, when we're talking about subconscious, we are aware that we're making these biases, but they occur more on an automatic level. So there's something that we can partially control when we have all of our mental capacities and cognitive capacities. But the more and more stressed we become, the less and less control we have with managing these subconscious biases. Okay, so again, what's the difference between explicit versus cognitive is that explicit we're very consciously aware of, okay? Whereas these cognitive biases that we'll be talking about are much more automatic in a sense, and a lot of times unintentional, okay? So we do need to note that when we're looking at these biases, we need to look at the difference between beliefs versus reality. Cognitive biases shape our perception, often leading us to errors that contradict rational thought. Okay, and let's start with some of the biases to kind of give an explanation of this. The first one is the universality of biases. Okay, we have found in cross-cultural studies that every culture tends to commit these biases, but their perception or their experience of them can be different based upon their cultural views. So here in a little while, we'll look at how people from an individualist society view these biases versus someone from a collective culture. So we'll see that while these tend to be universal, the explanation for them can be slightly different. I kind of often think about conversations about physics. Okay, so there's very set equations that determine acceleration, determine the mass, about movement, and all those kinds of things, right? And they're all fixed and they're all universal. We all use the same ones, okay? But if we take one of the universal laws of physics, which is an object will stay put unless another object hits it. So the movement occurs when two objects interact with each other. In our Western kind of physics area, They talk about the energy within one object that then transfers the energy to the next object, which it makes it move. Okay. However, if we go to, for example, more collective societies like Thailand, Japan, China, they don't talk about the energy transfer one object to another object. They talk about the energy between those objects. Okay. It's not a transfer of energy that is occurring, it's the interaction, the external interaction between the two objects. Same exact laws, two different interpretations based upon a cultural view. Okay. And this is kind of this going to be the same with these biases. We all commit them, but our interpretation of them may differ based on our culture. We also need to, when we look at this from a cross-cultural world, we got to think of something called meta thinking. Meta thinking, or thinking about thinking, helps individuals recognize their biases. Okay. So we'll go through some strategies on how to reduce our bias thinking, and it has to do with us thinking about our thinking process. Okay. And that's what the term meta thinking is. Okay. So let's go through some of these biases and errors. The first one is the fundamental attribution error. This is when people tend to attribute others' behaviors to personality rather than situational factors. Okay. So, for example, if somebody does something good or right, we may say it's an external factor that's probably due to luck or random chance that that person won the game. Okay. However, when someone fails, we usually make what are called dispositional or personality traits instead of looking at the situation. So, for example, one of the explanations of someone who is homeless, for example, people in the United States don't usually, now this isn't everyone, I know there's some well thought out individuals in this class, don't usually think when they see a homeless person, they usually don't think, he probably lost his job, might not have economic abilities, economic opportunities, intergenerational poverty, and seeing the situation. No, rather, unfortunately, one of the fundamental attribution errors here in the United States is that person is homeless because that person is lazy, or they can't hold a job. It's a personality thing. It has nothing to do with economics and social status and all those situational factors that tend to play into a person not having a home. Okay. So that's an example of the fundamental attribution error, is when you put dispositional or personality qualities on a person who has failed, okay, or is failing, okay. And as I did mention, we do find this in most cultures, this fundamental attribution error. However, the amount of times that the error is committed does have some cultural influences. So, for example, collectivistic cultures are less likely to commit this error compared to our individualistic societies. And in a way that makes sense, right? Because in an individualistic society, your success and failure is truly because of your personality. And that's how individualistic societies view success and failure, as something to do with the quality of the person, not necessarily the situation that put them there. Where in collectivistic societies, while they don't escape this error, but they're also more likely to think of situational variables that make it so an individual isn't successful or not. So they might say something like, that person is not very intelligent, but in the economic conditions that he's in, it's not necessarily that caused him to become homeless or do whatever it is that person did. Okay. So they're more likely in a collectivistic society to give more of an explanation that's situational, but they still may at times commit that individual disposition error. Self-fulfilling self-fulfilling prophecy is the expectations influence behaviors, leading to outcomes that confirm the initial belief. So, self-fulfilling prophecy is probably the best example is in research. This is a very simplified version of this research, but basically, what we had participants do is they came into the lab and we gave them pretty much just a bogus personality test. It really didn't measure anything. But the interpretation was a flip of a coin. If it was, let's say, let's hit it, it landed on heads, the participant was going to be told that they're going to have a positive, good day. Okay. If the coin landed on tails, they were going to tell them that they weren't going to be successful that day. They're going to have a rough time. Okay. And so in this self-fulfilling prophecy, you could probably guess at the end of the day, they come back and we ask them how many positive versus negative experience. And you can imagine that the people with the heads did the self-fulfilling prophecy and created more positivity in their day, whereas the people who were tails recalled more negative situations during the day. Okay. And this is an example of self-fulfilling prophecy that, if we could even simplify it more in real life, if you're late for work, get stuck in traffic, get cut off, you spill your coffee all over you, and you get yelled at by the boss for being late, you're more likely to have a bad day versus the morning when everything is perfect. The kids are ready to go to school on time. You're ready. You're motivated for the day. You have a nice, easy drive to work. You're more likely to have a better day. Okay. Now, that's a daily example of self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. We also see self-fulfilling prophecies about the quality of person that you feel you are. Okay. So, for example, if you go into a math class and you say that you suck at math, you hate it, you're probably going to do poorly in that class. Okay. And you're going to confirm how much you dislike mathematics, as an example. Okay. And again, when we look at self-fulfilling prophecies and culture, cultural expectations shape individual behaviors and reinforces the stereotypes that we talked about the other day. So if you remember, we had a conversation about stereotype threat, that we tend to, when we feel like we need to be behaving within a stereotype, we will do as kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as I mentioned in the research with the inner city Black men who had a threat before taking a cognitive test and they scored really low. But when they weren't in that setting where there was no threat, they actually scored just as good as the Stanford students. This is an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as you could probably guess, it's not necessarily something that the person commits consciously. It happens on that subconscious level of processing. Okay. And then the second fallacy or bias that we have is something called the naturalistic fallacy. Okay. This is the mistaken belief that what is natural is inherently good or right. That if something occurs naturally, then that must be good. It must be the right answer, as you would say. Okay. Um, we do see, though, that different societies define natural differently based on cultural norms and traditions. Okay. So if we look at, for example, here in the United States, we may view something like petroleum gasoline as something naturally occurring, therefore it's good, even though it's doing pretty much a lot of damage to our world when we're looking at things like fossil fuels. Okay, but because those things are produced naturally in the world, it's seen as something that is good and can't be a negative thing. Okay. We do know that when we look at, for example, a lot of Native American communities, not all of them, but many of them have the belief of nature and its ability to heal. Okay. Now, does that make that a fallacy? No, yes and no, if we want to put it in terms. Okay. So what can that lead to is the belief that, for example, vaccinations are bad or Western medicine is bad. Okay. When in reality, there's a good combination of both is probably the correct way to head in our mind. Okay. And then we have what's called the assimilation bias. This is a tendency to interpret new information in a way that aligns with existing beliefs. Okay. So in assimilation bias, it's when we hear something new, we try to fit it within an existing belief system. Okay. An example of this is, well, there's two examples that we can take from Christianity. Okay. The idea that there's these demons and these angels that are vying for your soul or your behavior or who you are. You got the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. That idea was actually a Freudian idea that came from Sigmund Freud. Okay. But after Sigmund Freud had been assimilated, a lot of what he said was assimilated into society, we saw Christian writing change some to accommodate for this idea of an angel and a devil and vying for your soul. Okay. If we look at, for example, again, using Christianity as an example, when children were start to seen as unique and childhood was a special period of time, this is where, again, going back to the Christian faith, is when we start to see more and more about Jesus's birth versus his death. Okay. And you see that within the Christian writing, and this occurred in about the last 200-300 years. So that's an example of assimilation bias. We can also see this in other religious sects, but we can also see it in a lot of non-religious or other cultural norms that we assimilate behavior into. Okay. And as you can guess, this assimilation bias can influence cultural misunderstandings and stereotypes. And then we have what's called the representativeness bias. This is judging probability based on similarities rather than actual data. Okay. So this is when we think one of in-group, out-group one in-group, out-group bias is that people of an out-group are more similar than people in the in-group. So, for example, as white European, or let me give you a person who is a white European American sees more diversity within their group. And then when they look at a Black American group, Black American groups, they think that they're more similar to each other than different. So we think that there's more diversity within our in-group, I guess what I'm trying to say, and less diversity and more similarities in out-groups, okay? And this is based on this natural kind of representative bias that we have, that we see things that look more similar to us, they must be more similar to us. But when we actually look at the data, Black communities are just as diverse as white European communities. Okay, so the actual data doesn't actually meet that perception. Okay, I know that Native Americans tend to get clumped into one group. Okay, but as all of you know, there's a lot of diversity between Native American groups and tribes. Even within the Tohono community, you can have different ways of thinking about the creation stories and symbols that are used, like the man in the maze, and it can differ on the nation from one community to the next. Okay, and so the representative bias really does skew how communities and people are seen, instead of seeing them for, wow, that's a very diverse and dynamic community. They're put into one cluster. And again, you could guess that cultural stereotypes influence the categories that we put people into based on their representativeness of that community. And then the availability bias is relying on immediate examples when evaluating situations or making decisions. So this is basically the bias to use what's available right in front of us to solve some type of novel or need to make a decision. Okay. And I will tell you, this is also the reason why, if you're studying, it's good to study in different locations each time you study. That way you're not relying on the situation when you're in taking that test or taking that or learning that concept. Okay. Let's see.